If you were to travel somewhere in 1907 and you weren't extremely rich, your plans would probably be a little bit tedious. You'd mount your horses to a carriage, though of course having horses also probably meant you needed someone to take care of them and food to give them, which was expensive and meant you probably had money. So maybe instead you'd hop on a bicycle or you'd walk where you needed to go. When it came to long distance travel, you could count on railways to bring you from one place to the next, but you'd still have to arrange some sort of travel once you arrived at your destination. Maybe if you lived in a big city, you could count on a bus or a tram. More than anything though, you probably wouldn't have owned or driven a car. Motor cars were expensive back in 1907, and they could be difficult to start, control, and maintain. If you could afford investing in an automobile, you were probably wealthy enough to also hire a chauffeur and some mechanics to maintain your machinery. In 1907, just over 140,000 cars were registered in the United States of America, a country that boasted 87 million inhabitants. Over in Europe, in 1907 France, there were a mere 30,000 cars on the road among 40 million inhabitants. So to put that pretty simply, cars weren't a big thing, and not many folks were driving them. But that all changed when, in 1907, one Parisian newspaper decided to stage an 8,000-mile race from Beijing, China to France. It was a race that would change the world. This week's episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys is a special one. Yes, we will be talking about the chaos of the 1907 Peking-to-Paris race, but we'll also be chatting to the author of a brand new book about that exact topic. Kassia St. Clair has spent the last few years working on unveiling the true story behind the much mythologized Peking-to-Paris race in her new book, The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris, the adventure that accelerated the 20th century. First, I'm going to get you up to speed about everything you need to know about this exceptional adventure, and then we'll speak to St. Clair about the intensive writing and research process that went into developing such an amazing retelling of a race that involved everything from Italian royalty to a massive cheating scandal to plenty of near-death experiences and so much more. Let's dive right in. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I hope all my Indy car fans out there are ready to scoop up some of the best merch of their lives, because DPTJ sponsor Homefield Apparel has not only launched some amazing Indy 500 merch, but it's also preparing to drop a gorgeous Aero McLaren collection. You do not want to miss out on this, so make sure you head to the link in my bio to sign up for McLaren drop updates. And if you're really interested in getting some Indy 500 merch, don't forget to pick that up as well. For all my first-time buyers out there, use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. European motorsport at the turn of the 20th century focused heavily on city-to-city distance races. This was an era before organized racetracks really came into focus, so contemporary automakers found the best and easiest way to show off their skills was attempting to cross a specified distance faster than anyone else. The first car race in the world was the Paris to Rouen in 1894, which was followed by races from Paris to Barcelona, Marseille, Amsterdam, Berlin, Vienna, and Madrid. As automotive technology improved, both automakers and competitive drivers grew hungry to show off their skills in longer, more arduous, and more adventurous events. These early automotive exploits also made for great press. Newspapers around the world breathlessly reported on these long-distance races, and the public clamored to watch history unfurl on black and white pages hot off the press. It was great entertainment, and it was also really great for the newspaper business. It should come as no surprise that the idea of the Peking-to-Paris race was derived from a newspaper. In the January 31st, 1907 edition of Paris's Le Matin came the germ that inspired the idea. What needs to be proved today is that as long as a man has a car, he can do anything and go anywhere. Is there anyone who will undertake to travel this summer from Paris to Peking by automobile? The idea for the long-distance race was partially rooted in good business, but it was also a deeply nationalistic affair. France was the mother of the automobile, the editors reckoned, and therefore her technology should be allowed the broadest possible event in which to display her talent. No piddly distance races, no laps around closed tracks. Why not instead race from the capital of the East, Peking, now known as Beijing, and the West, Paris, France? The proposal itself was so alluring that by the end of the day, several drivers and automakers had already telegrammed the paper to share their interest. By February 15th, less than 2 weeks later, over 18 cars had promised to take part, and soon as many as 40 different competitors eventually promised their involvement. However, when participants were asked to place a deposit and be prepared to ship off to China by the 14th of April, the field dwindled, so much so that the race organizers actually canceled the event. Still, on June 10th, 1907, 5 cars lined up to take the start with a total of 11 men geared up. Those 5 cars came from 3 different nations: Italy, France, and the Netherlands. Allow me to briefly introduce you to those crews and, without spoiling too much, give you a little sense of how they fared in their 8,000-mile journey. Heading into the Peking-Paris race, there were 2 distinct trains of thought about what would constitute a capable and successful car in this race. On one hand, a lot of folks believed that a lighter and less powerful car would actually serve best. Sure, it would be slower on paved roads, but the thought at the time was that it would be much easier to lift it out of obstacles due to its weight. And anyway, you weren't hitting paved roads until the final about 1,000 miles of the journey anyway. On the other hand was the argument that more power was always a good thing no matter what. So, let me introduce you to our competitors from the least to the most powerful. First, we had a wild machine named the Cantal Mototrail, an elaborate 6-horsepower, 3-wheeled machine that seemed to be more of a motorcycle than an automobile. It also featured one of the most perplexing layouts for driver Auguste Pons and his navigator Octave Foucault. The driver actually perched at the back of the 3-wheeled machine, using long handlebars to navigate. In front of the driver and in between those handlebars sat your passenger. Cantal driver Auguste Pons hoped to use the Peking-Paris as a way to launch himself into stardom and away from the obligations of family life. He was steadfast in speaking to the press before the event, but on the starting line, it became very clear that he and navigator Foucault would have a very long uphill battle ahead of them. The small size of the Cantal meant that they'd had to sacrifice luggage and emergency supplies that the other teams could easily accommodate. I'll let you take a guess at how far they made it into their drive, but I will say their Peking-Paris was much shorter than the proposed 8,000 miles. One step up in power were 2 French déambutants, both boasting 10 horsepower. The first was driven by Georges Cormier, who would send telegrams back to Lotto magazine detailing their journey. Alongside him was Jean Bizet, his mechanic. The second déambutant was driven by Victor Collignon, with Il Secolo journalist Eduardo Longoni serving as his number 2. Jean Bizet, who was to serve as a mechanic, had spent years working on cars, but had never actually sat in one until he left the starting line of the Peking-Paris race, which should tell you just how socially stratified automobile ownership and use was back in 1907. Driver and journalist Georges Cormier would join him, and he's described by Kassia St. as being the most intimidated of the bunch. He had founded an automobile dealership in Paris and had also undertaken several solo journeys around Europe, but Cormier had never driven on such rough terrain before. Upon arriving in Peking, by train, not by the ships because he was scared of ships, he became something of an organizer for both of the déambutant teams. He found supplies and sent folks out from the second déambutant on a reconnaissance trip just to get a sense of what the road ahead would be like. In the second déambutant was Victor Collignon, a cheerful, upbeat sportsman and a former Olympian who had picked up motor racing and then later mechanics. He was the kind of man who preferred to take orders rather than give them, so he struck up a really close kinship with the far more organized Georges Cormier. Also in that second car would be Eduardo Lagoni, an unassuming rider who only made it part of the way before he was replaced. On the Peking-to-Paris, the Dédiambutant teams agreed to work together, feeling more confident about tackling obstacles as a group. Next up on our power scale was the 15 horsepower Dutch Spyker, a vehicle that was staffed with some real characters. Very little was known about driver Charles Godard before the race, but the Peking-Paris highlighted his reputation as a serial con man. Godard claimed that Spyker, as a firm, had loaned him a vehicle for the race and had also promised to pay all of his expenses. He liked to drop that fact when, say, negotiating payment, and Spyker, as he so earnestly promised, would repay all of those debts for all of the equipment he gathered before leaving. As it turns out, Spyker had no idea about these promises, and the equipment that Godard purchased before he left, he actually turned around and immediately sold to gain passage on the ship heading to Peking. Joining him at the start of the trip would be Jean Dutilleux, a journalist for Le Matin who had earned his career by writing, editing, and publishing detailed books about France's many colonies. It's thanks to Dutilleux that we have so much compelling detail about the 1907 race. But when the Spyker befell trouble partway through the event, Dutilleux headed to Dédiambutant and replaced Eduardo Lagoni. The Spyker would reappear, thanks largely to some tomfoolery by Charles Godard, for the final part of the race, at which point Godard was joined by Spyker mechanic Bruno Stephen. Finally, at the very top of the power food chain was the obviously Italian team driving a very obviously Italian car, an Itala. This elegant machine could produce anywhere between 35 and 45 horsepower, and it was also packed with 3 men for the duration of the trip. The Itala's so-called primary driver was Prince Luigi Marcantonio Francesco Rodolfo Scipione Borghese, who hailed from one of Italy's most illustrious royal families. The Borghese fortune had dwindled by 1907, but the prince launched the family name back into the pages of the history books with his adventurous nature. When it came time to choose a mechanic and relief driver for the Peking-Paris, Prince Borghese chose a man named Ettore Guicciardi. Guicciardi had actually been hired by a mechanic by the Borghese family back when the prince was just 15 years old. When it was time to select a teammate for the 8,000-mile drive in the Itala, Borghese selected the comfort and loyalty he knew he could expect from Guicciardi. The third man in their caravan was journalist Luigi Barzini, who would regularly send dispatches back to Italian magazine Corriere della Sera and the Daily Telegraph. Even though several teams had done some preliminary recon, there was no way any of the Peking-Paris competitors knew what faced them. Soon after their departure from the walled city of Peking, the men would reach the Gobi Desert. Then, the rained-out muddy roads of Siberia and the Ural Mountain ranges. For most of the journey, they would be carving their own roads out of uninhabited countryside, often passing through small towns populated by people who had never even heard of a motor car. The odds against them seemed insurmountable, but the men there didn't get involved in the Peking-Paris because it was easy. They did it to make history. There we go. Perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm so excited to talk about your book. I just dove into the Peking-to-Paris race a couple months ago and was like, this is just so much.
Yeah, that's how I felt when I first came across it. I was like, this is everything. It's got everything.
It does. I was looking at old photos and I was like, I can't believe human beings did this to themselves.
I know.
But would you mind by kind of introducing yourself to my audience, sharing a little bit about who you are, and what your career path has been like?
Sure. So my name is Kassia St, and I'm a writer, and probably the accent gives it away, but I'm British and I live in London. Um, this is my third book, and it's called The Race to the Future, and it's about an incredible journey, an incredible race that took place in 1907, in the early days of the automobile from Peking, now Beijing, overland to Paris, so about 8,000 miles westwards across 2 continents. Um, My two previous books were on quite different subjects. The first one was called The Secret Lives of Color, and it told the stories of 75 different pigments, hues, dyes, that kind of thing. And then the second one was called The Golden Thread, and that's about the history of different textiles from the very first fibers that we know human beings ever touched, right up to the synthetic fibers that they are looking to create in order for people to, survive on the way to Mars in spaceships. So that was really good fun. I got to look at how Vikings made sails out of wool and stuff like that. Before I became a full time author, I used to work at magazines. I worked at a magazine that now no longer exists called Intelligent Life. And then I also worked at The Economist in the books and arts department. And before that, I worked at House and Garden and The World of Interiors, two kind of British magazines looking at, culture and style, that kind of thing.
I was gonna say I'm such a big fan of The Secret Lives of Color. When your agent reached out, I was like, oh my god, I have one of her books on my shelf, and I love this one. I did a bunch of like when I was trying to decide what colors to paint my house. I had that out of like I want to know why I want to like paint this.
Mm. I'm always both. It's never happened, but I'm like both excited and scared in case I ever see someone on the underground or tube in London or like on a train or just out and about with one of my books, because it'd be really exciting to see someone with a book, like not a friend or a family member. But
Mhm.
I'm also really worried that I'd just be a total creep and I wouldn't be able to just like wander up and sort of be like, hi.
That's me. I wrote that one.
They'd be like, great, thanks, leave me alone.
So, your previous work has been so different than this upcoming book on the Peking to Paris race. What inspired you to go kind of look into this crazy automotive adventure and focus on that instead?
Sure. So I guess there is a sort of real difference. I think you can kind of see that colors and textiles are, sort of, they're not similar subjects, but they've sort of got enough commonality. And you can kind of imagine the people who are really interested in color, might also be the kinds of people who are interested in textiles. And, you know, if you're looking at it from that angle, then a book about a car journey looks really different. But I guess for me, there's more similarity than difference. Firstly, they're all history books,
Hmm.
and secondly, they're all three are about topics. And I think this is this for anything that I write, books and articles, that the things that tend to really excite me and get me passionate and subjects that I can really dig my teeth into are often things where the subject is something that is really kind of ordinary and everyday, so much so that we have kind of forgotten how fundamental it is. We've just stopped seeing it.
Hmm.
And I quite like re-examining those really ordinary things and finding, the history to them. And I also feel like looking at something that's very ordinary and overlooked can kind of give you a different perspective on your everyday experience. So
Hmm.
for me, that is true of color, that is true of textiles, and that's also true of the car. I'm a Londoner. I've lived in London all my life, and I feel like even though I'm not a massive petrol head, I live in a space that the car has kind of, inhabited for a relatively short period of time. The car is not that old as technology, but it has made the city its own.
Hmm.
And, we think about space and distance and time in ways which are dependent on the existence of the car. Our roads are built to accommodate cars. The surfaces of them. It's a surface that suits wheeled vehicles rather than horses and carts and things like that. And so I was just fascinated by the fact that I no longer really question that when I think about going to see my sister. She lives a couple of hours away by car. But that my conception of how to get to her and where she is in relation to me, that is just defined by the existence of the car. And I found that really fascinating that that's just so much part of our mental space,
Hmm.
despite the fact this technology is relatively young.
I think it's so fascinating that you bring this point up because that's part of what I try to do with my podcast is like I think a lot of people take the modern motorsport for granted.
Mhm.
But there's always a reason why we ended up somewhere. There's a reason why we use the colors that we use for certain things to convey certain emotions. There's a reason why the entire universe, especially here in the United States, is built to accommodate the
Mm.
car. What is like the short, concise synopsis of the 1907 Peking-to-Paris race that kind of got you hooked and that will get future readers interested?
Sure. So in 1907, the automobile as an idea is still relatively new. It's kind of like early adolescence. People often date the very first automobile to kind of the late 1880s,
Mm-hmm.
with Carl Benz. Although, like almost all technologies, the beginnings are kind of contested. So in 1907, the car is still quite young, and it's very much seen as kind of something just for the wealthy,
Mm-hmm.
and that's globally. I think a few years previously, the president, the American president at the time, had basically said, you know, cars are responsible or could be responsible for socialistic feeling in America, because
Mm-hmm.
ordinary people will look at drivers and feel so enraged by such a conspicuous display of wealth
Mm-hmm.
that they will just want to attack. And there were loads of instances of people, attacking drivers. So this is the context. And then in 1907, a Parisian newspaper, Le Matin, has the idea of testing this relatively young technology and throwing down a gauntlet, the most incredible challenge that has yet been proposed for this technology. And that is a race across two continents, 8,000 miles, from what is seen as the capital of the East, now Beijing, then Peking, to the capital of the West, Paris, at the time. And so they propose this journey. Lots of people sign up, and only 5 cars make it to the start line, and off they go. And there are, no roads for most of the journey, because roads were seen as quite an old-fashioned technology, which sounds odd to us now.
Mm-hmm.
But for the past century, countries have been busily investing in railways, and so roads were associated with horses and carts,
Yeah.
and that was, so they hadn't invested money in making good the surfaces. So you don't have good roads in China or Mongolia or for most of Russia. And so there's also no petrol stations, so fuel has to be taken out by camel and by mule or dropped at railway stations. It's a real logistical challenge. It's a real geographical challenge, and yet 5 cars set off, and on the way there are incredible adventures and mishaps, and there's so much within the story of the race, but just the idea of the race
Mm-hmm.
captures people's imaginations, and it's followed closely by a lot of the newspaper reading public globally, because the journalists who are embedded with the drivers are sending back daily or sometimes twice daily news reports that are being sent to newspapers worldwide.
That's amazing. And how, like, obviously this captured imaginations at the time, but it also must have captured yours because you set off to write a book about it. What was kind of the inspiration that you had to transform this wild thing you've learned about into a full deep dive?
Sure. So I think the story of the race itself is just really fascinating and
Mm-hmm.
deserved another look. There were a few books written about it at the time by journalists, by the journalists who were involved, and all,
Mm-hmm.
all the competitors who were involved. So you get kind of like a little rash of books about the race in 1907 and 1908. And then there's another flare of interest in the kind of 1950s and 1960s. When there's kind of this big nostalgia for the early days of motoring. And then there've been a few books written since, but there hasn't been much reinvestigation into the original race since then. And so I thought that it was likely that I'd be able to find new sources, given we're now in an internet age, and we've got more possibility of travel and so forth. So I was really excited to re-examine it. And I very quickly found in my initial research that there were sources that hadn't been found before, which was really exciting. And I was like, I think I can get a new angle on this. But also going back to the point about what draws me to write a book about a subject, I also felt that we're in a really interesting time now where most people have grown up assuming the car will last forever, and yet we feel very differently about the car than maybe our parents' generation or the generation before that. It no longer feels inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are more worried about the consequences. We're much more aware of the environmental harms. We're thinking actually, even for people who really love driving, are getting very fed up of the way that driving, the way that we have to drive now, things like endless traffic,
Mm-hmm.
um, log jams, that kind of thing. It's, when you think back to those early days, when you read the accounts of those early days when people were sort of really enthusiastic about driving and really championing the idea of the car, even those who wanted the car for everyone, they wanted people to be able to access, speed, and also the open highway and the open road. And as someone who lives in a city and which is often gridlocked, that's not
Yeah.
something that we have access to now. So I feel like we're in a period of kind of re-examination and thinking about where the car might go next. Is it going to be a different fuel source? Is ownership going to look slightly different? I think there are lots of different ways in which the car's future might play out, and we're beginning to look at those now. And so it felt like a really great time to write a book that examined the car's origins and the origins, the whys of how it's turned out now, at a
Mm-hmm.
time when we're again kind of thinking about where the future might take us.
How has your own perspective changed since you've done all this research, kind of learned those initial aspects of the automobile? How have you, like, in the modern sense, has that changed you any?
I mean, I'm someone who, although I'm not a petrol head, I'm someone who's always, I was one of those people who um, got my provisional driving license like the first day that I could. I saw the car as freedom,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also someone who lives in the middle of a city. And I midway through writing this book, I fell pregnant, and then I've now got a daughter who's approaching 2 years old. And something weird happened during pregnancy where my sense of smell got really
Mm.
overdeveloped. I'm not too sure how common this is, but I really started, like, the smell of petrol fumes really started to bother me. Um, and I've always cycled around London as well as having a car. And the smell of fumes has never bothered me. I've grown up here, but now it really bothers me. It hasn't really, that sense hasn't receded.
Mm.
And so I think I'm a lot more aware of the harms that mass automobile usage can have on people who are, living in cities. The health implications, and the smog and the pollution bother me in a way that they never really bothered me before. But I feel very conflicted because my love of the car and my reliance on the car and my feeling of my love of driving hasn't altered.
Mm-hmm. And as you've researched this book, where did that process take you? I mean, mentally and physically, if you've had to travel any.
So I was writing this. I got the book deal in 2019, and then the idea was always that I was going to do the route myself.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband and I bought an old Toyota Land Cruiser, and we took delivery in January 2020. And then, of course, the world shut down. And then it kind of shut down again in 2021. And by the end of 2021, I was pregnant, and I was like, oh, maybe I can still do still do the journey. And then the following year, war broke out,
Mm-hmm.
and Russia invaded Ukraine, and almost, a lot of the original route passes through Russia. Um, I'm still learning Russian, in the hopes that one day I'll be able to do the journey, this time with daughter and in tow, probably. But it wasn't in the end possible for me to do the journey, which is really gutting. Um, but but yes, that is that's the case on the travel front. In terms of where it took me kind of emotionally and internally, it was very odd writing a book about, that at its heart is about the joy and the possibility and the chutzpah of traveling such a long distance in such a new and untried technology during a period where I've never traveled so little in
Hmm.
those 2 years when I was doing the bulk of the writing, just because of COVID. We were, chained to our houses, and we had periods of time where we were only allowed to leave for 1 hour a day, as I'm sure
Yeah.
you've had. And so it was very odd writing, following this journey. And I've got a map up behind me, as you can see, that I also had in when I was writing the Peking-to-Paris book. The map of this huge expanse, this huge geographical expanse, and yet I was more geographically confined than ever before during the writing. So that was a very odd that was a very odd experience.
Hmm. I think one of my favorite things about working with kind of older research and historical materials is being able to take them and transform them into a story. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but you're working on such a much like a larger scope than I think I've ever done with any of my podcasts, and even with the book that I wrote previously, just because it was so recent. How did you organize and make sense of all of that information I'm sure you had collected? I know you've got your map, but I'm sure like the notes and whatnot had their own system.
Oh God, was there a system? So I was really intimidated by this project at the beginning because it involves a huge amount of primary research. So first off, you've got all the contemporary newspaper and magazine articles that were being written
Hmm.
during the race, and they are some of them are in English, some of them are in Italian, a lot of them are in French. My French and Italian are okay, but not at a level where I'd be really confident, particularly when, it's using a
Hmm.
lot of motoring terms and it's that kind of very early 20th
Yeah.
century. You know, I very quickly realized that while I can kind of get by in Italian or French now, reading newspaper articles from 1907 about a car journey, like the words they use, you
Totally
just don't,
different.
it's very hard. So I knew I had all that and I was going to have to use translators. You've also got the books that were written at the time, and they are subtly different from the articles in on kind of fine points of detail. And I needed that point of detail because of the social conventions at the time, lots was left unsaid.
Hmm.
And so working out what has been culled, um, things that were written in the heat of the moment, then later during the editing process when they were calmer, they'd take things out, and that was very revealing about how they felt and how they wanted to manage the narrative. So there was that. So newspaper and magazines, written by the participants, and the books. You also have the newspaper articles written about the race at the time, and then you also have all the kind of supplementary information, because the way that the book is structured is you have alternating chapters. You have a chapter about the race, followed by a kind of contextual chapter. So something like, fuel development, and the kinds of different types of fuel that were being used at the time, and why we kind of ended up with the way that we think about petrol or gas now. Then you might have kind of a chapter on horses and how cities operated when they were dependent on horsepower rather than automotive power, or women in the car. So you then have all the kind of both primary and secondary information on these contextual chapters. It was a lot. I really got myself into. I mean, I fairly quickly organized a system, but when you're dealing with that volume and having to switch back and forth, oh my goodness, you can get yourself into into a little bit of a muddle quite easily. But the system that I ended up working with worked in the end, and by the end of it, I was really familiar. I have like six. I'm not sure if you call them the same thing in American English, but I had like six ring binder
Hmm.
folders. I'm not too sure, lever arch
Yep.
folders of information, six full lever arch folders. And I basically kind of knew exactly what was where in each of them, and I could,
Hmm.
pull it out if I needed it. So yeah, you manage, your brain expands when needed to.
Did you have any kind of aha moments or like breakthroughs while you were working on this, like a piece that was missing that you finally got back together or something of that nature?
Absolutely. So very early on, I there were sort of two things that I don't think previous authors had done, which really surprised me. So I think firstly was the map and plotting. You can see behind me on the map, I
Hmm.
plotted out the route using different bits of like colored string for each car because they took slightly different routes. And secondly, that was really helpful. But what I also needed to know is how long it was taking them to travel between these points.
Mm,
And plotting that out um, was really, really, really helpful. It showed me where the cars were going faster and slower and where they were sort of having real difficulties. You can get a sense of that from
hmm
the narrative, but when you can see that, on some days they're traveling, 120 miles, and then on some days they're barely managing 5 or 6, you're really getting, the
hmm
sense of the frustration, and it adds quite a lot. But also it illuminated the fact that one of the cars has this puts on this incredible burst of speed about 2/3 of the way through the race. And in the more recent accounts of the Peking-to-Paris, they're seen as the hero, the kind of unsung hero, because they manage these incredible endurance drives of kind of hundreds of miles, with
mm,
barely only sleep over a couple of days. And plotting those out was very revealing, because it showed me the scope of what they were claiming to have done, and it also gave me real doubts as to whether that would have actually been possible.
yeah.
Um, and it meant that because I was starting to have doubts, just because logistically it was very difficult, and also the route that they'd chosen was I could see it was suspicious. It meant I went looking for evidence that maybe they hadn't achieved what they said they had. And eventually I managed to find, evidence that, I'm very happy with, and I'm very convinced kind of shows that they didn't accomplish quite what they said they did.
That's always exciting. I love being able to kind
Mm,
of find the bits where it's like, oh no, that definitely did not happen the way you said it did, and
yeah.
I finally know
Mm,
why. I love that
mm.
so much. Were there any particular anecdotes that have stuck with you since then, whether they're profound or funny, what have you?
Yeah, so the leading car had an absolutely dreadful day. They had been authorized because the roads were in such poor condition. This is fairly early on. They've just left Lake Baikal. They're they're a little bit ahead, but not much ahead of the other vehicles. And they just have an awful day. They are forced off the railway bridges back onto the regular road, and then very quickly after they fall through a bridge,
Whew.
and the car flips over. They all end up in the river, and one of them is seriously injured. He takes a really bad blow to his back and spine. They manage to get the car out, and it's still running, and they get back on the road, and this time they decide they are going to stick to the railway tracks. So then they're bumping along the railway
Mm,
tracks, which are obviously, they're not, the wheels don't exactly fit the gauge of the train, so they're having to go on the sleepers. And so you've got this jolting journey, and every time they reach a bridge, the sleepers aren't, you know there isn't much, the bridges are quite narrow. They're built for the trains, and so they have this kind of nerve-wracking jolting journey over these railway bridges where there are no sides. It's just, the the metal rails, and then the sleepers underneath. That's it. So there's nothing between them and just falling off the side. And then they encounter a train that's coming the opposite direction to them,
ooh,
and their wheels get stuck, and all the passengers abandon the car, except for the poor man whose back was injured earlier that day, when the car flipped. And he suddenly finds that he's unable to move his legs, so he's obviously done
mm,
some sort of nerve damage, and he can't, he's trying to lift them with his hands to get to rescue, to save himself and get himself out of the car, but he can't. And as the train is sort of bearing down on the car, finally someone manages to push the car up and over the rails, and they go down the embankment and make it to safety. And they kind of hobble into this small town after this. They must have been completely shell shocked, and the only place available for them to stay in this little village is the old theatre where miners put on like Amdram productions. And so they have to sort of make up camp and fall asleep on the stage, and they can't find the stage lights for ages. They're kind of like stumbling around trying to turn off the strong lights that are used on the stage. And I just the story of that day and ending as it is in that way really sticks with me as just an incredible moment for the depth of the emotion and despair and anxiety and relief that they must have been feeling.
Were there any mindsets that you had learned about? I know, like, when you go back and do this research, there's such a different attitude toward cars at the time than there is now. And that process
Mm.
has always been evolving. But were there any attitudes or mindsets that you read about, like, regarding the automobile that surprised you or felt especially relevant or totally irrelevant now?
Mm. So they are really excited about speed, that the capacity for speed really excites them.
Mm,
And a lot of the most lyrical accounts that the participants write are during the times when they're able to get up some speed, which actually isn't that often because the roads are so poor. But there's an incredible moment when they're sort of going through the Gobi Desert, and the sand of the desert is relatively hard packed, and so they can actually get up a fair amount of pace. And there are wild horses, a herd of wild horses kind of starts galloping alongside the car. And you know, that really sticks with them, that they kind of worship the speed and the possibility of speed that the car gives them in this way that we just, you know, we just don't think about it as being such a
mm,
we think about it in a very different way. We're excited by it, but it's the fervor and the way that it's tied to civilization and progress is very kind of late 19th century, early 20th century. There's also the very colonial mindset
mm,
in that they feel that they are bringing a new technology to benighted peoples, to barbarians. They feel like the automobile is a symbol of progress and an illumination, and they are able to bring it to a part of the world that doesn't have it. This narrative that they have is very strong at the beginning, um, but as they actually realize the limitations of the car and they have to rely more and more on local people, that kind of disappears and alters and adapts. You know, it's kind of not really a it's kind of this sort of optimistic um narrative that doesn't really survive encounter with the real world.
mm.
But in the first few days and these first few accounts, when they're kind of looking ahead and imagining what the journey will be like, it's a very, very, very strong flavor of their narratives.
I think that's so fascinating. I've seen a lot of the photos where there's like local folks picking up the cars and moving them from somewhere
Mm,
because of the mud being too thick or what have you.
mhm,
I love that the actual like encounter with reality changed their perspective.
mm.
Did your perspective on what you wanted this book to be evolve as you were writing it?
Absolutely. So, you know, I when I first started doing the research for the pitch before I started fully into writing the book, I was really excited about kind of upending um, this kind of this race as being kind of like a way of upending um, several different worlds simultaneously. So you've got this the birth of this new technology. You've also got the um, move of the technological heart of the automotive world from Western Europe to America. You know, the year after this race concludes, the very first Model T comes off production lines, and you know already that shift is happening. But you know, I think 1908 is such a pivotal year with the
Mm,
first Model T that you can really see that that shift is completely inevitable in 1908. So it just felt like such a great it felt like such a sort of neat pivotal moment in so many different ways. And again, you know, of course, you actually start writing it, and just like the drivers have their sort of contact with reality, those narratives become a lot messier, and that's not a bad thing. I think the
mm,
story is richer for the complicated nuances that come up. But you know, things like I was really excited by the possibility of the fact that maybe the winner that had been announced at the time wasn't actually shouldn't actually be celebrated as the real winner. Maybe it should be another person, and maybe the winner at the time had been announced because he was sort of a very high social standing, and
Mm,
maybe the true hero was someone who was more of a modern man, and that seemed like one of those kind of neat arcs. Um, However, you know, looking at it, I actually felt that the right person won, um, and and that was something that surprised me in the research and the writing. But the more I learned about him, and I was able to meet quite a few and speak to quite a few descendants of the various participants, and everything I learned about the winner was solidified my feeling that he was the deserving winner.
mm. And from a much broader perspective, learning about the evolution of the automobile, is there anything that surprised you or anything like you've learned and you're like, "Well, how did we get where we are today if that was the mindset then?"
Mm. So I think something that makes me a bit sad actually is the fact that in 1907 you have lots of different fuel types
Mm,
that are still being experimented with, and eventually, particularly when the heart of the automotive world transfers to the States, you get petrochemicals, you get gas coming out on top as the winner, and I feel like it's a real shame that that is the case. I wish a plurality of fuel types had continued to be used, because actually the way in which we use vehicles is different. If you
mm-hmm,
are you know, lots of people own cars as little city runarounds then and now. Lots of journeys are very short. In fact, the vast majority of journeys are very short. And at the time, they had electric automobiles that
mm-hmm,
were very useful for that kind of thing. And wouldn't it be great if people had sort of thought, oh, we need a different, petrol's really useful when you're going a long distance, but actually for most of your journeys going short distances, we can have something that is like, electric, and that would be great. You also had people thinking about other fuel types. So, alcohol based
mm-hmm,
fuel was something that they were really excited about experimenting with at the time. And you also had steam. So if they were using really heavy loads, so for kind of the transportation of like heavy goods, they were using steam. Now, that isn't to say that all of those fuel types would have been commercially viable long term. There is a reason why petrol won
mm-hmm,
out. But I think if we had been able to retain the mindset that that actually it was no bad thing having a plurality of options for different uses, I think that could have been a really useful model. The other thing that makes me sad is that there were quite often sort of fleets of taxis or vehicles, particularly electric vehicles, being used at the time in 1907 in cities. Places like Berlin and London had sort of fleets of electric cars, and I think um, car individual car ownership isn't great for cities,
mm-hmm,
because in cities space is at a premium. It's much better really if you can, if you're not wasting loads of space on parking. That makes cities much nicer to live in, because you can get around, and you're not kind of reliant on having to get in your car
mm-hmm.
every time you need something. So um yes, I wish that kind of plurality mindset and the openness to other options hadn't been kind of snuffed out so early in the 20th century.
I think it can really surprise a lot of people when they learn like electric vehicles are
Mm,
not a brand new invention. They were, back at the start of the car,
mm,
we had these totally different forms of technology. It was just we all decided we're going to go one route and that
mm.
was it. What was the most rewarding part of writing this book for you?
Oh goodness, that's a great question. To be honest, uh, I I was really excited about tackling a very big challenge, and this book was complex. You are trying to tell a great story about one particular journey, and then you've also got these, interleaving essays, contextual essays, and so it's a very big story, and there's lots of ground to cover, and so having been able to complete the book to my satisfaction and accomplish what I set out to do was immensely satisfying and really scratched an itch. My previous books had been based on shorter essays and so were structurally a lot simpler. And this was much more complex. It's not something that I'm known for. As a journalist, I've predominantly written about kind of color and style and culture. And I was, assistant books and arts editor at The Economist. So, that's where I've spent my time. And so tackling a big new topic with real devotees who are going to pick you up on mistakes, that felt very satisfying. And I'm sure that there are mistakes, and I'm sure that devotees of motorsports will bemoan the fact that I haven't spent as much time on the kind of technical details. But I also really wanted to make this story accessible for generalists, because most people experience the car as generalists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt that was really important.
And what's next for you? What are you kind of delving into for your future projects?
So I was sort of working on a couple of pitches at the beginning of this year for new projects that are kind of big history projects of the type of Secret Lives of Colour and The Golden Thread and now Peking-to-Paris, along similar lines. One which I'm really excited about is kind of staying in the sports realm. But actually, a couple of months ago, another project came up which requires an incredibly tight deadline. And it's actually a bit of a return to kind of the color and the textile world. But it's for a big brand that has an anniversary coming up, and it's an incredibly tight deadline, but it's a really exciting project. So despite the fact that I heard the deadline and sort of like inwardly and I think maybe even outwardly like shrieked in horror, I still was really excited to take it on. And yes, I'm working hard at that at the moment, but I want to return to those other pitches when I can.
Perfect. Those were all the questions that I had for you. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I am so excited to read this book. Like you cannot even imagine.
Oh, well, I really hope you enjoy it.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I think it's a great story, and I hope your listeners get excited about it and enjoy the episode.
When the 1907 Peking-to-Paris race finally came to a close, no one had much of an idea about how profoundly this adventure was going to change the world. No one was leaping from their cars, preparing to offer countless innovations or to introduce new philosophies about the motor car. However, the breathless coverage of the race in newspapers all around the world transformed the race from just that, a race, into a whole new way of thinking about the vehicle. See, in 1907, the automobile was still extremely fallible, and the jury was out about where they would rank in the grand scheme of transportation options in the future. On one hand, you had a group of people who firmly believed that motor cars were one of the most promising inventions of all time, while a very large and equally loud contingent argued that actually these slow, heavy, inefficient, expensive, and loud machines would never manage to stack up against a network of competent railways and horse trails that had linked one city to the next. Vehicles were just a plaything for the rich, a fad that would pass with time. The Peking-to-Paris race, though, highlighted that these cars actually were really capable. Yes, they did excel on neatly paved roads, and yes, they struggled through just about every other kind of terrain. But most of the cars that set off from China did make it back to France. Rainstorms, mountain passes, deserts, inhospitable towns, broken wheels, car fires, and exhausted passengers simply failed to put a damper on the abilities of this newfangled automotive machinery. It was enough of a triumph that all those skeptics were forced to consider the potential these vehicles held. In the aftermath of the race, several other key events took place that proceeded to change the future of the automobile. First came Henry Ford's innovative Model T. Released in 1908, This universal car democratized the act of motoring for large swaths of the world that had previously considered these machines out of their reach. The Model T was cheap, durable, and easy to use compared to other cars being made in the era. Unlike the Model T, many automakers had treated the creation of a vehicle as an art form. They provided multiple kinds of body styles and wheelbases, tons of colors, varying capabilities, and enough options to make your head spin. The Model T rolled off the line loaded with innovations, but the version of the car that you bought would be pretty much the same as the one your neighbor bought. That enabled Ford to speed up production and lower costs, which let a whole new economic demographic see these vehicles as achievable for the first time. Further, because they were easier to operate than the previous iterations of the automobile, you could more easily get people behind the wheel without requiring a specific skill set. And then came World War I. War has a tendency to cause massive sweeping changes in everything from social welfare to technology, and when tensions reached a breaking point on July 28, 1914, the automobile eventually became one of the key players. The vehicles that hit the battlefield still weren't particularly stunning, efficient, or reliable, but they were way more efficient and reliable than the previous primary form of transportation during war: horses. Supplying horses to the front was costly thanks to the labor it required to raise and care for the animal, followed by the care that they need during the war. Horses needed huge amounts of food to sustain themselves, and they also needed to be brushed, washed, shod, and more. Horses naturally shy away from loud noises like gunfire, and should a horse return from the front, they often exhibited signs of post-traumatic stress disorder in much the same way that human soldiers did. The cars of World War I may not have been particularly fast, reliable, or comfortable, but they required fewer supplies and less care to function well when compared to horses. And the Peking-to-Paris race proved that this burgeoning technology could handle terrains once considered impassable. Still, the first waves of troops in the Great War were staffed with tons of animal power. Horses, mules, oxen, camels, donkeys, elephants, pigeons, cats, dogs, mice, reindeer, even canaries. It was only as the conflicts really dragged on and that animal death toll rose and supplies continued to dwindle that various militaries had to begin bulking up their supplementary automotive forces. When cars started being deployed in greater numbers during the war, their advantages were clear. They were more difficult to target than railway lines, which meant that supplies could more effectively be brought to and from the front without having to worry about bombings or raids completely ruining that element of transportation. Motorized ambulances could more quickly transport injured soldiers to medical care. Vehicles could take on a fair bit of damage before they became unusable and didn't require any time to heal injuries. Soon, automakers were building specialized vehicles for war, including heavily armored tanks that promised to bring an end to trench warfare stalemates. Then, after the war, St. Clair notes that a widespread influenza pandemic killed millions of people, and that drastically changed the demographics of people who were using vehicles. Women needed to join the workforce and relish the freedom that a vehicle could provide. The influenza had killed a lot of people, and so there were fewer people to care for large fleets of horses, necessitating a change in transport for the folks who previously relied on the animal power of their stables. And as vehicle production ramped up during wartime, so too did the number of vehicles on the road. All this, in large part because a daring slate of 11 men embarked on an 8,000-mile journey across 2 continents a decade before. I truly cannot praise St. Clair's book enough. You guys know how much I love plenty of historical context in my motorsport stories, and The Race to the Future is absolutely packed with detail, whether that's about the Peking-to-Paris race itself or about the societal changes that made such a trip possible in the first place. The book is organized in such a way that one chapter will discuss the progress of the race, and the next will establish some important elements of context to better help you appreciate the feats being completed by these daredevil crews. As drivers send their first telegrams, St. Clair helps you understand how critical an invention the telegraph was. As drivers trek through rural Siberia, St. Clair discusses the long history of the horse as a form of transportation and why we had to move on to something new. In another chapter, she just as artfully explores why gasoline became the de facto power source for automobiles, when at the turn of the 20th century, we were using everything from alcohol to electricity to move motor cars. When she describes the harsh landscapes of the Ural Mountains or the Gobi Desert, she draws on additional written work from other adventurers who had completed similar journeys in previous years, albeit on horse or on camel. After all, the intrepid adventurers of the Peking-to-Paris weren't always particularly interested in capturing the nuance and ambiance of a region, especially after a particularly trying day or in areas where telegraph stations weren't readily available. I wrote about this sentiment in my book review for Jalopnik, but part of me wants to call this book a romp, while another part of me feels like that just wouldn't do justice to the incredible amount of work that Kassia St. Clair has done. So many parts of The Race to the Future are a blast. I never wanted to put this book down because I was always desperate to learn more about the dramas of the Spiker team, the impressive feats of the Itala, or the raw frustration of the De Dion drivers. I was also pretty damn desperate to contextualize the impressive feats of these drivers. I wanted to know more about the place that women held in the automotive world, or about the evolution of the road from a public gathering place to a place where the presence of a human body was criminalized. I wanted to know about the logistical nightmare that horses had become as cities grew larger, and about how the introduction of the automobile could change different locations in so many different ways. I have to send all my thanks to Kassia St. Clair, both for taking the time to join me in Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys, and for writing this book in the first place. The Race to the Future is going to have a place of honor on my motorsport bookshelf from here on out. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. After this episode, I'm going back to my original every other week posting schedule, but you are not going to want to miss the next episode. We're delving into the most dangerous job in motorsport history, riding mechanics. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, please make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts and newsletters where I delve deeper into all things motorsport. And if you want to send an email, I have an address for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. This week, I want to share a great comment from Slow Car Fast, who writes, "Finally, a podcast that gets into the darker and, dare I say, more interesting facets of racing." After the Donut Racing show was canceled, I was thrilled that Elizabeth announced this podcast as she quickly became my favorite host, and she always offered great context to the episodes. Thank you so much for the wonderful words, and also for the amazingly helpful feedback about audio mixing. I know I've mentioned this before, but this podcast is my debut into the audiovisual realm, so I'm always learning as I go. I also want to give a very special shout out to Patreon subscriber Ryan Lorman. Ryan is the very first member of the World Champions Patreon tier, which means so much to me. Ryan, thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you also want a shout out, make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to check out Home Field Apparel. As we get closer to Indy 500 season, we're getting so much great open wheel merch. And don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. And speaking of the Indy 500, if you'll be at the track on race day morning, please come hang out in the Pagoda Plaza. As it gets closer to race day, I'll post more details on my social media accounts, which are linked in the description. Every year, it's my personal tradition to hang out for a few hours, chatting with anyone who wants to come say hello. It's super low stakes, so hang out as long or as short as you want, bring your friends, wave from a distance, I don't mind. I just want to see your wonderful smiling faces everywhere I go. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important for me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to the most influential sources at the end of each episode, with the full list in my description. This week, our list is short, sweet, and to the point. My info came from The Race to the Future, 8,000 Miles to Paris, The Adventure That Accelerated the 20th Century by Kassia St. Clair. By the time this episode is posted, this incredible book will be released, so make sure you go show your love to everyone who's keeping the wildest stories in motorsport history alive and well. The link to the book will be in my description. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.